We'll talk about marketing mix modeling today. There's two things that I want to talk to you about. Marketing mix modeling more broadly, a bit of a deep dive, and then we'll touch base specifically on the Robyn package that Meta's marketing science team developed. If you have any questions, there's a chat window, or there's actually a Q&A window as well. Let me just bring that up, and you're able to ask me any questions during the webinar or after the webinar. But let's get started. I'm going to assume that about half of the audience today, just kind of looking at the backgrounds, is sort of expert level when it comes to marketing analytics, and I'm going to assume that half of the audience is sort of strong analytics background, maybe not as much in machine learning. And so I'm going to try to sort of walk the middle line, and hopefully I can explain things in a way that kind of makes both audiences happy. But again, if you have any questions, just ask a question in the Q&A chat. So welcome to the future or the past of marketing decision making. And I'm kind of jokingly including the word past because what we're talking about marketing mix modeling is it's not a new concept. It's been around for the last 3 decades or so at least, and really became popular in the mid 90s. Certainly a lot of activity in the early 2000s. But what's interesting is when we ask companies, and this is a survey that we've done with about 100 or so commercial leaders across kind of eight or nine big industries, 2/3 of them said that they have no clue what the return is on their marketing spend, right? And so I think that's not unusual, and that's been my experience as well in companies, particularly in B2B, a lot of retail environments, a lot of actually more like distribution environments, so B2B services, right? Lots of marketing spend. Not a good way to actually quantify what the impact of their marketing spend is. Typically industries where marketing is the primary revenue generator, so things like nonprofit, they have a really good grasp of marketing returns, but overwhelmingly companies still have very little idea. Those that do use sort of marketing analytics to understand what the impact of marketing is, about half of them use attribution modeling, and we'll talk about sort of the challenges of attribution modeling today and into the future. And about a fifth use marketing mix models exclusively, and about a third of them use both, right? And that's what I really advocate to folks is use both techniques to actually understand the impact of your marketing spend and make adjustments. You'll get sometimes widely different answers, but I think there's some common themes that you can address and make some sort of incremental improvements in your marketing strategy when you use both efforts. But I think the most important point on this slide is, right, just understanding what the impact of your marketing spend is and having really robust marketing analytics. That's paramount to any revenue growth analytics separate, right? When we talk about revenue analytics and sort of more broadly revenue growth management, I think most people talk about pricing, right? Just optimizing prices and optimizing promotions or perhaps discounts. And I think many people miss the point that optimizing your marketing spend is just as crucial, right? For many companies, marketing is typically the second sort of biggest commercial spend after their promotions and discounts. And so you really need to have a good grasp of how to optimize that spend, how to optimize your budgets, and how to get more revenue and more profit as part of your marketing effort. So I really want to underscore that point. For those of you that haven't taken the survey, feel free to do it. It takes like a couple of minutes. There's the link, and it's sort of a revenue growth analytics maturity scorecard. And once we have, I want to have about 250 respondents or so. We'll send out some aggregated insights and sort of a study at the end. Okay, marketing mix modeling. I think most of you are familiar. Those of you that are not, what is it, right? At a very high level, it's nothing more than a fancy regression model, right? That tries to explain the impact of your marketing spend at the channel level or at the sub-channel level, or sometimes at the campaign level, the impact of your marketing spend on your business results. And typically that you're trying to explain it in terms of revenue, right? So how much of your revenue was driven by your marketing spend at a fairly detailed level, right? It's sort of enjoying its renaissance right now. the phase out of third-party cookies and some of the privacy changes and privacy laws are coming into play, as well as some of the changes that are enacted by the big advertising platforms, tech companies, is making direct multi-touch attribution really difficult, right? And I think more companies are realizing, well, especially the ones that do omni-channel marketing, we need to do some marketing mix modeling, right? And it was really popular again in the 90s and 2000s. And so it's making sort of a comeback, and more companies are doing it. Because you're using aggregated data and you're essentially employing a statistical model, right? It's privacy friendly. You're not using any sort of customer data, be it anonymized or not, or de-anonymized or actual customer data. And it's really sort of resilient to some of the issues that you're dealing with attribution models, right? So people deleting cookies, using different devices, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's all it is. It's a statistical model that lets you explain the impact of your marketing spend, right? Why do we use marketing mix modeling? Right? Some of the key questions that companies and commercial leaders need to answer, like how much of my sales is driven by each of my marketing investments, right? Both online and offline. What is the ROI of my marketing channels? What is the optimal spend level for each of my marketing tactics? And then strategic questions, things like, if we need to cut budget because it's a tough year, where should we do that, right? What is the channel that is most inefficient, or perhaps where we have high levels of marketing saturation or audience saturation? Where should we cut that marketing budget, right? Or conversely, if we have another $1 million to invest next quarter, where should we do that in a way that maximizes the business results that we're trying to optimize? Again, most typically it's going to be revenue. So again, those are some of the essential questions we're using marketing mix modeling for. The reason we're talking about Robyn today, right? We're sort of in this era of democratizing analytics and democratizing machine learning, right? And so when we talk about marketing mix modeling yesterday, which is really sort of the trend even nowadays, right? But three things are sort of plaguing marketing mix modeling efforts, right? It's really expensive. Most companies, especially mid-market firms or maybe smaller firms, it's sort of out of the question to spend $200,000-$300,000 or $100,000 in a marketing mix study. It takes a long time, right? I've been part of marketing mix modeling studies by large information providers, right, that took several months, and limited access, right? So typically or traditionally, it's been either specialist firms, specialist consultancies that do this stuff, maybe large advertising agencies, or big information providers. Nielsen and IRI are a good example, right? They sort of did this stuff with companies. And so again, nowadays, with the availability of many sort of open source packages that are very domain specific, with superstar data scientists sort of sharing their approaches in code on Medium and things like that, you have a lot of these methods at your fingertips, right? And so what I always like to say, and especially in commercial analytics, for again, most sort of traditional companies, there's a tremendous value in sort of having these good enough solutions, right? That'll still get you to 90% of the value realization, but you're able to do it fast. You're able to get insights that you can act on. And you're able to sort of, test out the impact and make adjustments, right? But you're able to iterate really fast. And if you make mistakes, you sort of, adjust your strategy and sort of move on, right? But I think it's important in most business settings where you fail fast and you sort of iterate in doing these things, as opposed to, right, taking half a year to sort of perfect some sort of an analytics modeling or analytics study, right? And so again, today it's cost effective, right? It's fast, and most of these things are democratized, right? But let's dive a little bit deeper. We talked about some of the advantages, right? I talked about the fact that it's enjoying its renaissance. So more and more companies are gravitating towards marketing mix modeling, right? Some of the key strengths we talked about, it's privacy friendly, signal resilient. Again, the key point here is you're using aggregated data, right? You're not using detailed customer level data. The second big advantage, perhaps over things like multi-touch attribution, is it's a statistical model, right? As part of the modeling effort, you're including more than just marketing variables to explain sales or the impact on sales, right? You're including pricing and discounts and and key events and seasonality, or like distribution if you're talking about retail or wholesale business. And so you're able to tease out the impacts of those non-marketing variables as well, right? And it's really important for not just the sort of control for the impact of those things and really understand the true marketing impact, but it's also important for scenario analysis, right? What happens if I change my marketing budget and I happen to change my promotional strategy? What is the impact to my business? And you're really able to sort of quantify that. And it's flexible, right? So like you're able to adjust the algorithm and adjust the model in a way that aligns best with your particular industry or particular go-to-market model. When we do marketing mix modeling, like most modeling, right? But especially sort of doing these types of models where the cost of errors is potentially really expensive, right? Especially if your marketing budget is substantial, you want to make sure that your data is really accurate and it's really clean, right? So again, it's especially true with things like marketing mix modeling. It's especially true with things like price elasticity models, right? You want to make sure that your data is accurate, and you also want to review it with key marketing experts that are part of your team. We talked about some of the common questions initially, but let me just kind of go through some of these, right? You're able to use marketing mix modeling to understand how much of your sales is driven by each of the channels. What is the ROI? What should be the optimal spend level? If I make changes to plan, either increase or decrease my marketing investment, what is the impact to my business? Understanding the impact of some of the exogenous things, right? That we talked about pricing and promotions and key events and things like that. Or understanding where the budget cuts needs to happen, right? And again, when we do this sort of modeling, this is not going to be perfection, right? But it's going to give you a good directional guide on what your strategic adjustments need to be, right? And that's how you should sort of look at it, right? It's not the absolute truth, but it'll lead you to sort of the right direction. When we do marketing mix modeling, and this is again traditionally what happens today, right? In terms of how long it actually takes to do this stuff, right? It's anywhere between 3 to 4 months, right? Nowadays you can do it much faster, provided that you have the data, right? Data collection typically takes the longest time. But modeling nowadays, right, instead of 4 to 8 weeks, which was the case yesterday, right, or the case in sort of traditional settings, you can do the modeling piece in like, a couple of days, right? And we'll talk about how you actually do that. But data collection typically takes the longest time, especially for offline media, things like TV and radio and whatnot. It's really hard to collect the data. Most sort of more sophisticated marketing operations and companies have good data sources for that. Most larger marketing agencies that have good data engineering and data management teams have a pretty good sort of readily available collection of offline marketing impression and spend data. But for the most part, it's really messy. And for the most part, a lot of sort of mid-market and small size marketing agencies only have plan figures, right? And it's really hard to do modeling off of those. We'll talk about the pre-modeling phase, and then we'll discuss Robyn, and then in the end, if we have maybe like 10 minutes, we'll go through some of the code. And by the way, all of you will receive this presentation, and you will also receive a code for marketing mix modeling using Robyn. We have a slightly modified version of the demo script that Meta's marketing science team did, and so we'll make sure that that's available for you as well. But data collection is obviously really important. You want to make sure that you have enough time. You want to make sure that there's enough review efforts with internal marketing experts. The one thing that I'll underscore on this slide is use actual data, never use plan data. I think most often when you use plan data, again, like many agencies, when they work with clients, they sort of peanut butter spread out the costs for TV and radio and whatnot, and so it's just not going to be impactful, right? Because think about what a regression model does, right? It essentially tries to correlate changes in your marketing spend to changes in your revenue, right? And it tries to establish a relationship. And so if you have plan numbers that don't have a lot of variation, the model will just simply say like it's not that impactful, right? So that's why you always want to use actual figures. The second point that I'll maybe emphasize here is you want to make sure that you include other relevant variables that are not particularly highly correlated with your marketing variables that are but are relevant to explaining sales. So things like pricing, things like discounts, things like competitor sales if you have competitor sales available, things like competitor price indices, right? So your price relative to the price of the competition if you have that available. Again, these are all important metrics that you want to include in your marketing mix model. For independent variables, probably the most important thing is you want to collect metrics. You obviously want to collect the spend metrics for your paid media, organic media, and some of the other sort of non-marketing related efforts, but you want to create sort of these variables that are eyeballs or impressions, right? The representative of how many people have seen something, how many people clicked something, or how many people interacted with something, right? And so again, for like Facebook and paid search, right, you want to include impressions. For things like maybe, I don't know, newspapers, newsletters, print, whatnot, you want to include like readership or subscribers or something like that. For offline, like TV and radio, the most often they're using metrics like GRP, gross ratings points, right? But you want to, again, want to create metrics as part of your modeling that is analogous to how many people have been exposed to that particular marketing effort, okay? We talked about other external factors, but seasonality and sort of holidays like that, that's sort of a given in most industries. You want to include that. And one of probably the easiest ways to include that nowadays, if you're using open source packages, is just to use Profit, which is ironically also Meta's sort of time series modeling package that's available both in R and Python. In terms of the sort of the temporal scope of your model, or how much data you're collecting, what is the time frame? You typically want to have weekly data for at least 2 years. I like to have at least about 3 years, ideally if you have 4 years. Why? Because you really want to evaluate sort of that medium term brand building aspect of your marketing efforts as well, right? So not just short term, which attribution modeling is very short term. It's all sort of immediate effects for the most part. But you want to, again, include more robust historical data so you can sort of understand the longer term impact of your marketing efforts. If weekly data is not available, if it's only monthly data, it's fine, but then you want to make sure you have an even longer time frame. So 4 or 5 years at a minimum, but ideally, maybe 6, 7 years, right? The more data you have, obviously, the more robust your model is going to be. The other sort of nuance thing that I'll call out here is for some of the additional data that you'll use for marketing mix modeling, you also want to include things like certainly seasonality, but also like anything that deviates in a substantial way from historical norms that you think is influencing sales. So if you're in a distribution or retail environment, maybe excessive deviations from historical norms in terms of temperature, right, or snowfall, or whatever you think that actually impacts sales, you want to include those as part of your modeling efforts. Why? Because they impact sales, and you want to sort of model for those outlier events that are happening with your business results. Some of the variables, we talked about these, but just to kind of visualize it, this is just sort of a toy example that I put together for retail, right? So your modeling will obviously incorporate some of the paid media, both spend and impression metrics, right? You're modeling off of impressions, but you're optimizing your marketing budget based on some of the spend. You want to include things like number of stores, obviously, or number of distribution points, and some of the other things that we talked about, seasonality, COVID, et cetera, right? Somebody asked the question, Kunal, thanks for the question. During COVID, there was no spend on media. How can we capture this into the marketing mix model? Also, as we don't have any media spends, it will affect the modeling process. Yeah, it's a good question, Kunal. We tend to, we've dealt with this with other clients. There was sort of a dip in marketing spend. Some clients had a dip, others actually sort of accelerated their marketing spend, things like nonprofits. But yeah, so you want to include a variable that sort of represents that COVID timeframe, right? And that could be, it could be, things like a mobility index, which I think like Apple and Google has sort of published that, right? That kind of tracks people's movements based on their GPS location. That was really sort of a proxy for, people's ability to sort of go to places, right? But that was a really good proxy for the COVID era. I found that to be really valuable for marketing mix modeling, right? So yeah, you can certainly include those periods. My only advice there is include periods pre-COVID, include the COVID period, and then include post-COVID periods as well, right? Because you want to be able to model throughout that time frame, and then just use the proxy for that interim COVID period when there was no marketing spend. The model should be able to capture the fact that any impact on sales was due to other things, especially things like COVID. Okay, in terms of granularity, right? So ideally, when you do the marketing mix modeling, you want to go down to a more granular level. So things like DMA or region, MSA, or state level, it's ideal. But the reality is most companies, and I think most agencies, particularly when we talk about the mid-market level, so like companies ranging from 10 million to like $1 billion, right? That's sort of the mid-market, at least here in the US. You're just not going to have that level of detail. You'll certainly going to have it for your digital marketing efforts. Is sort of easier to tease out, and a lot of the digital platforms have that level of reporting granularity. For things like TV and radio, it's much harder, and so national is totally fine. I think for most companies, doing national modeling is certainly good enough. The one other call out here is for your marketing channels, do a breakdown in terms of channel and sub-channel at least, right? Sometimes it's appropriate to go down to the campaign level if you have a few major campaigns within each channel, right? But if you have, dozens of campaigns, then it doesn't make sense. You'll just simply have too many variables. But go down at least to the sub-channel level, so like Google, YouTube, paid search, or Facebook, whatever, Facebook ads versus Instagram, etc. So you want to go down one level deeper from the advertising platform level. Okay, we'll talk about Robyn, and we'll spend maybe 20 minutes here, and then we'll go through some of the code. I want to be conscious of the fact that maybe not everyone's a sort of devout programmer or machine learning person, so I don't want to bore those folks. But what is Robyn, right? So it's simply an open source package that specializes in marketing mix modeling, right? It's a really cool framework that was developed by Meta's marketing science team. They're constantly evolving it. It has some issues here and there, but for the most part, it's really sophisticated. It works really well. It gives you an ability to develop these sort of quote unquote good enough marketing mix modeling solutions that you can do fast, get insights, make decisions, test out those decisions, and move on, right? And I think that's the intent for most businesses, is to be able to move relatively fast with these sort of good enough solutions. The underlying technique they're actually using is it's called ridge regression, which is probably the closest thing. It's a form of linear regression that does a reasonably good job of handling multicollinearity, which is the idea that many variables are going to be highly correlated with each other. So pricing versus promotions versus maybe some marketing efforts versus seasonality. Like sometimes a lot of these variables are highly correlated with each other, and so a technique called regularization, which ridge regression employs, does a good job of sort of controlling for that. It's probably the next best thing outside of doing maybe more advanced machine learning methods like ensemble models or neural networks, right? So that's what Robyn uses. The two other sort of critical things to marketing mix modeling that Robyn employs and optimizes for, one is ad stock transformation. We'll talk about. It's the idea of sort of marketing having decaying or diminishing sort of effects on the consumers and individuals that are exposed to that particular advertising. And the other one is saturation, right? Is this idea that incremental marketing investments will have sort of diminishing returns depending on where you are in the saturation curve, right? If you just started your digital advertising efforts for, I don't know, paid search, and you're not highly saturated at all with your audience, right? Your growth rate and your incremental or your marginal ROI is going to be that much bigger, versus if you're sort of at the tail end of saturating an audience or saturating a market, your incremental marketing spend is going to yield less return, right? That's the concept of saturation. What can you do with Robyn? You can do budget optimization, right, which is essential. And then you can get some granular insights around your marketing impacts on your marketing performance efforts. And then, of course, attribution, right, which is, again, based on this sort of aggregated statistical model-based attribution. Why is it useful, right? I think for most companies that don't have the resources to hire specialist firms, or don't have the resources to, turn to, IRI or Nielsen if you're in the CPG world, but they have some reasonably strong data scientists, or they have some intellectually curious marketing analysts. You can learn this stuff and you can actually do it in-house, do it yourself, right? It's cheap, it's fast, and it allows you to make some smart sort of data-driven decisions in your marketing efforts versus relying on gut and sales folklore. Dennis is asking, hey Dennis, happy Friday. Is Robyn an AI model? I've heard that Meta is releasing their AI models to the public. It's not an AI model, Dennis. It's and I'm saying that in the sense that in my mind, nothing is an AI model just yet in this world, right? It's all sort of machine learning, and we're calling AI huge machine learning models with billions of parameters and a ton of computational costs, but to me it's still not AI. So in that sense, this is not an AI. This is sort of a I would say this is a basic form of machine learning, right? This kind of sits between a linear regression based approach and sort of a machine learning approach, right? So that's how I would characterize it. But really good question. Okay, some of the categories that we'll actually use in the model, right? Obviously, paid media variables, organic. Organic is really important. Make sure you include things like PR activities, right? It's very, very important. Most companies have fairly robust PR efforts that have an influence on sales, that have an influence on customer activities. And so you really want to include those efforts as well. Ideally for PR, separate digital PR from more traditional things like TV or radio or newspaper outlets. And then we talked about context variables, right? But that's how Robyn treats these sort of buckets of predictors that you use to actually model your sales, right? Kristen, great question. Yeah, that absolutely. You should include organic social as well. So you can include, things like, blogs and the things that you see on your social pages, etc. Absolutely, 100%. The output, and we'll talk about this, but when we actually do marketing mix modeling with Robyn, we sort of get an output of the top models, and each of these models are sort of measures based on their model fit. And because it's a form of regression, right, we actually capture the R-squared value. And I think for those of you on this call or in this webinar who are sort of statistical purists or maybe data science purists, right, R-squared is not the best way to sort of determine whether some model is the best or not, right? There's other metrics that are more appropriate, but R-squared is something that most of us in business are anchoring to, and I think even kind of the layman marketing executive will sort of understand or remember what R-squared is. And so Robyn measures that. Typically you want to be in that 0.8, 0.9 or higher range, but again, there's other metrics. When you do the modeling, Robyn will automatically do sort of this training validation test set split of your actual marketing data. And so it measures something called NRMSE, which is a normalized version of a root mean squared error of your particular modeling efforts, right? So the lower the number, the closer you are to zero, the better. Okay. If you have a low R-squared value, right? If you have really crappy RMSE figures, particularly for your validation and your test set compared to your training set, well, you need to make some adjustments. And those adjustments could range from including more predictors. So like Kristen has a question about organic social. Maybe it's not included. Maybe you should include it and rerun the model. You can employ or try different regularization parameters, which is something that is sort of the key hyperparameter for ridge regression, right? Or you can look at some variables that are super highly correlated with each other, like 90% plus or 80% plus, and either combine them or just eliminate one of them, right? Good. Can Robyn gives us, baseline sales. Yeah, so Kunal is asking a really good question. Can Robyn give us baseline sales without a marketing spends and then compare incremental sales? I need to scroll down with different promotional activities. Yeah, so yeah, you'll be able to calculate baseline sales, Kunal, with Robyn, right? Because essentially what it does is it teases out the portion of sales that are attributed to your marketing variables, both paid and organic, as well as for some of these exogenous things like promotions and coupons and discounts, et cetera, right? So you're actually able to tease out what your baseline sales are. And then incremental sales of different promotional activities. It won't give you, it'll give you incremental sales in a sense, because marketing related revenue is going to be incremental sales by its true definition, right? Because you're spending extra dollars to drive incremental sales over your baseline. But you can also calculate incremental sales driven by promotions, right? You can actually use the model to sort of, predict what your incremental sales are versus your baseline sales. Good question. Okay, I'm going to skip over these slides. I think some of these things will be apparent when we look at the output of the actual modeling. But let me talk about two things, guys, for those of you that may not have done maybe a marketing mix model. So the two elements that are critical in the model and that are both sort of optimized as part of Robyn. One is ad stock, which is this whole idea of marketing impact has sort of this delayed diminishing returns, right? Or delayed diminishing effect on the purchase, right? Or influencing the buying cycle. And so my ugly visual that I think I just sort of copied and pasted from a Google search. If you look at week one, let's say, Kunal saw an ad at TBF for, I don't know, beer, right? And so the initial effect of that particular advertising for Kunal was really high. And then the next week, he didn't see the ad, but it was still sort of influenced by that beer ad. And then week three, right, there's another sort of small effect. And if you look at those ratios, it's maybe, call it 25%. So let's say the decay rate is 25% each week. So each week you're sort of impacted or influenced by 25% of the initial exposure to the advertisement. And then, I don't know, let's say in week four, Kunal buys that beer, right? And so the model is able to sort of attribute that, sales or that revenue to that particular advertisement in week four or week five. Why? Because there's still some slight effect that is lingering based on this assumption of what the ad stock or the decay rate is. Okay, so that's a really, really important component of marketing mix modeling. And again, that's something that Robyn optimizes based on some lower bound and some upper bound numbers that you sort of feed in. The other one is saturation, which is a little bit different, right? It really talks about the fact that the marketing has sort of this diminishing impact or diminishing returns, depending on how little or how well you're saturated in the marketplace, right? So if you've, if you're constantly or reaching a huge audience and you've done that for a long time, you're likely highly saturated, and you're likely sort of in that top rectangle that you see, right? Where you're sort of oversaturated. Any incremental spend that you see on the horizontal axis, sure, it's going to yield some incremental sales that you see on the y-axis, but that incrementality is going to diminish, right? And it's going to be really small compared to when you're sort of in the first box or the first rectangle, right? You see that response curve, almost at the 45-degree line, right? So any incremental spend that you're doing for marketing will have a correspondingly sort of high incremental sales result, right? And so depending on where you are in your marketing life cycle and depending on how much of the audience you're reaching and what the effectiveness of that particular channel is, your saturation curve will vary, right? And the strategy around pulling back investment or the strategy around accelerating investment will also heavily depend on what your saturation curve is for a particular channel. Okay. Besides evaluating the impact or the ROI for your marketing spend, Robyn allows you to do budget allocation, right? This is a really cool thing. There's primarily two things that it does. One is sort of a historical retroactive budget allocation. So in 2022, I spent $50 million on marketing. What should be my optimal, what should have been my optimal budget allocation for 2022 based on what the model results are, right? And it will give me an idea of maybe I should have pulled back Facebook by 10%, maybe I should have accelerated paid search by 20%, etc. But it'll give me an idea what the optimal budget should have been, sort of based on some past period. It's a really good analytical effort, even though it's hypothetical and retroactive, but it's a really good analytical effort to do like in the beginning of the year for the prior year, because that'll really sort of influence how you should think about marketing investments for maybe not for the entire year because you're already too late, but at least for like the next 2 or 3 quarters, right? The other optimization element or effort that it sort of encapsulates is a future spend. So let's say I'm in 2023 now, and I have an extra $5 million to spend over the next 90 days. Where should that money go in a way that optimizes my incremental revenue, right? And so you're able to do that with Robyn, and again, in a very sort of few simple steps. Okay, so I'll let me do this, guys. Let me just sort of visualize the output for those of you that may not have seen it. And some of this output it's based on a toy data that Meta's marketing science group puts out, but at least you'll be able to see what Robyn does. And we'll kind of go through the code in the last 5 to 10 minutes. It'll give those an opportunity to drop off if you're not interested in the actual code. But we talked about the model fit, and this is an example of what Robyn outputs, right? So we used what looks like 3 years of data, beginning of 2016 to 2019. The orange line is the actual revenue, right? The actual sales dollars. The blue dotted line is the predicted. You kind of see how well the model fits. The split between the training data, the validation data, and the test data is going to be seen here. So, right, it's roughly that 65, 17%, and 17%, right? It's sort of typical what you see in modeling efforts, right? You tend to see sort of a 70, 15, 15 split, or some variation, kind of plus minus 10% typically. But Robyn also optimizes what that optimal sort of split is for the time series modeling. This is a really cool chart. So Robyn will tell you what the impact of your marketing efforts were in your sales. So of the total sales that you generated in this period, right, over the last 3 years, whatever that is, it's like, I don't know, I'll say like $300 million, right? If you just add those numbers up, it will show you how much of it was driven by competitor sales, how much of it was driven by sort of a pure trend or seasonal trend in that sense over the last 3 years, how much of it is sort of a statistical intercept as part of the modeling. But really the things that you're interested in is down here. How much of your revenue was driven by spend on TV advertisement, out of home, things like billboards and whatnot, Facebook spend, paid search, right? Obviously you have the impact of holidays here. So, right, TV generated 5% of your revenues for 14 million, et cetera, right? So again, a very sort of quick baseline visual of what the impact of your marketing channels was. Pay less attention about whether this makes sense or not. So for example, competitor sales, it's toy data, and competitor sales are really highly correlated with actual sales, like 95%. So ideally what you want to do is you also want to include things like relative pricing. So what has been your price for that given week relative to the competitor's price, right? And that's an index typically that you're going to get, right? So I think it's really important to include it there as well. Okay, the next output that we'll get, again, is really important. We'll get the ROI of each particular marketing channel, along with the share of the effect, which is this light blue line, and the share of spend, right? And so you'll immediately see which channels are more or less profitable. Again, this is a toy example, so all these channels are they have a negative return in that sense, right? So you're sort of getting 74 cents in each dollar invested, but you're losing 26 cents in that sense, right? And so in some ways it's realistic because most marketing efforts are losing propositions. at least when it comes to, sort of modeling their impact over a long run, like 10 years. They tend to have a positive impact, because that's when you get into the impact on brand equity and brand building. But typically, when you do modeling over 2 to 3 years, most marketing channels will have kind of a sub-1 ROI. And sometimes some digital channels will have or in excess of 1. But this is really cool, right? Because suppose, just for the sake of this example, imagine this 0.78 is more like 1.2 or 1.5, right? And you'll see that the share of spend is perhaps much lower on search than some of the other channels, right? That's a good sign that you should consider increasing the spend on this channel, right? Because the share of effect is so much higher, the ROI is so great, and you're not spending enough. So maybe that's the channel that you need to consider increasing your investments in, and you can actually test it out, right? See what an optimized budget allocation looks like, or run the model and see what the results would be for your revenues if you were to increase your spend by X dollars or X percent, right? The next step it will give you is the decay rate, right? So this is the ad stock that we talked about, right? So 2 things that are really important: ad stock and saturation. Saturation is part of your modeling. But this is sort of a summary of what the model assumed or calculated the decay rate to be by marketing channel. So, for example, TV spend almost 70%, and then some of the digital channels, it looks like it's like 28%, 27%, and so forth. It makes sense intuitively, right? You typically will expect TV and radio to have much higher decay rates. Maybe 70% is overkill, but 50, 60%, right? So in week 2, you still have that 70% of the impact of the initial marketing exposure for TV. In week 3, you'll have 70% of 70%, right? 50%, and so forth, right? That's sort of the idea. And so this just simply summarizes, hey, when you think of your marketing channels, how lingering is their sort of effort, or how lingering is their impact on your audience or on your customers, right? You can see that search is much more immediate. Same thing with print. This is related to the previous graph, right? So this actually show you and decompose the marketing impacts on your revenues in terms of an immediate impact and in terms of that carryover impact. And so what you'll tend to see is the higher the decay rate is for a particular marketing channel, the higher the share of your revenue impact that is carryover, right? So sort of lingering effects beyond that week 1 exposure, right? So it makes common sense. Again, the 2 are related to each other, but it allows you to have that conversation with your marketing team. It allows you to have that conversation with your CMO, right? And it allows you to really, use that as an input into budget optimization, use that as an input into your long range forecasts and things like that. An example of a saturation curve, right? We talked about that. This is what the model output. Again, what you're visualizing is sort of that average weekly spend on whatever this marketing channel is, paid search, right? So this is sort of this average weekly spend. You're right here. This is the revenues, right? So 20,000, 40,000, so forth. And so you can kind of see that this is your current average spend level. This curve is not particularly steep, but you're also not at the point where your incremental effects and your marginal ROI is going to be that super diminishing, right? If your spend levels were here, like, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, that would be a lot more concerning, right? Because every incremental investment is just yielding very, very low results, right? So you're sort of losing money more and more the further you go on this axis, right? And so it looks like, for this channel, this is sort of this optimal range of where your spend should be on an average weekly basis, right? Conversely, if your spend level was more like here, sort of in this lower left corner, right? That would sort of imply that, man, you need to increase the investment on the particular channel because you have some room to grow, and your marginal returns are still going to be relatively healthy if you increase your spend level. Okay, this is Facebook. Again, similar concept. You can kind of see where your average spend is. Again, where you don't want to be, and where you need to consider pulling back your investment, it's sort of this where the line is starting to flatten out, right? And so same thing with TV spend, right? This is more of an S-shaped curve. But again, similar concept. This is sort of your healthy range of sort of modifying your spending. Past this, whatever this is, $1 million point, or past the $750,000 point, that's when your marginal returns are going to be diminishing at a much greater rate. Okay. I'll show you a couple of things and we'll flip over to the modeling. This is an example of the retroactive optimization that I showed you, right? So again, how should our 2018, how should it have looked like in a way that's more optimal for generating sort of higher sales or higher revenues, right? And what the model will give you is what your average spend of the total marketing spend was in 2018 and what your optimized spend is. And again, it will do that through a combination of the ROI of that particular channel. It'll optimize it based on the saturation of that particular channel, right, as well as the decay rate. So it'll kind of go through all those iterations and consider all those metrics to kind of give you an optimal result. And so again, you'll see that basically the model or the Robyn algorithm said spend less on Facebook, spend less on out of home, spend more on print, and keep paid search flat and spend way more on TV, right? It's a little bit counterintuitive for 2023, right? You tend to typically see with most organizations a heavy up on digital. It tends to be more effective, particularly with kind of millennial and younger crowd. But again, this is a toy example, and so I don't know, maybe you're marketing to a bunch of 80-year-olds and need to spend more on traditional TV. What I'll show you on the right side is, again, what your average weekly revenues are that are driven by that particular channel. So the average week from Facebook, the model estimated, right, that it generated about $78,000 or $79,000 in the optimized sort of marketing allocation, it would have generated $64,000, right? But look at the increases you will get from print, and you look at the increases that you get from TV. So those will offset some of the declines that you see in these other channels. And so your total revenues would have increased by 7%, which is quite substantial depending on the size of your company, right? But your total revenues would have increased by 7% just by keeping your overall marketing budget whole. You're just sort of reallocating the marketing spend for the various channels. This is the same concept, except this is a forward-looking optimization. So the question was here, I have $8 million to spend over the next 90 days. How should I allocate the money, right? And so again, toy example, but this would sort of have some similar results. It will basically say, hey, spend more on TV and allocate more on search and allocate more on print. And you're going to spend 1.6% more than what your planned budget is. But you will get almost 12% more in revenues, right? That's a really, really good trade-off, right? It's sort of a common sense. And again, take this as a directional sort of advice, right? Modeling is highly assumptive. Yes, it's a sophisticated algorithm, right? It's really cool, but it's highly assumptive, and it's a model, right? So models are always sort of kind of loosely representative of reality. And so I think my best advice for you guys is go after sort of low-hanging fruit, like investigate the results and investigate the channels where modeling will sort of imply, hey, this is really bad, the ROI is really bad, or you're way oversaturated, right? And sort of make some adjustments and do some tests in those cases, right? I think that's what it's for the most part sort of used for. I'll show you the code real quick. I think we have a few minutes left. And then if you have any questions, or sorry, guys, there was a couple more questions. Kunal said, how can we explain what an intercept is? Yeah, honestly, Kunal, I wouldn't even explain. I would just sort of gloss over that particularly if you're talking to business stakeholders, but you can certainly try to explain it as hey, if nothing happens, you have no, price investment, or no changes in pricing, no changes in marketing, no investments in marketing, no effects on competitors. This is what your sales are. But again, it's not the right explanation. It's also not intuitive. So I would just sort of gloss over that, right? It's purely an output of statistical models where the algorithm is trying to optimize the results, right? It has no business relevant explanation, so I would just sort of gloss over that. Kunal also asks, do we have an ideal benchmark for ROI by channel? There are certainly benchmarks that you can get. There's going to be industry sources, et cetera, you can kind of search for. Robyn will not give you that. And then Kunal also asks, can we bound spend based on historical data? So example, my company can invest $1 million in TV, and if the model is showing me to invest 2 million, which is not possible, can we bound by a certain range? Yeah, absolutely. So let me do this, guys, in like 5 minutes, and it actually logged me out. I'll do this in 5 minutes, and you'll have the code. So I'll make sure it gets sent out to you guys no later than Monday. There's also a fairly good chance. Okay, there you go. It came up. So I'll go through really fast. Let me try to minimize the screen, and then we can always follow up with me afterwards if you have some key questions, right? But this is what Robyn modeling looks like, right? We're kind of loading the data. This is what the data looks like for marketing mix modeling. Again, we talked about it's aggregated data, right? This is weekly data for the last 3 or 4 years, right? You have revenue, which is the thing that you're trying to model for. It's also the thing that you're optimizing for. And then you have the various sort of spend and impression metrics. For some channels, you may not have impressions, so you're going to include spend, which is totally fine, right? This is the kind of the baseline of you building the marketing mix model. And again, if you just sort of look at it visually, like it's so much simpler, right, than kind of starting a marketing mix model from scratch, right? Again, it's not going to be as accurate as a seasoned marketing modeling expert creating something from scratch, but it's going to be good enough, right? And it's going to be much faster. It's going to be allowing you to make some shifts in your marketing strategy much faster, right? But this is where you set, again, this is some of the seasonality variables. You use the profit package. This is an example from Germany, which is fine. So it's including holidays from Germany. This is where you spend and specify your paid media spends. This is where you specify your paid media variables. For the most part, it's impressions, except TV and out of home. And I think print, we only have spends. But ideally, you want to include like GRP for TV. This is where you specify your organic variables. It's a newsletter, but I think Kristen asked about organic social. That's what you would specify it as well. And then you have some context variables, right? Fairly straightforward. Hyperparameters, right? So this is where we specify the kind of the hyperparameters for your ad stock and also for saturation. And so I'm not going to go too much into that, but theta is the hyperparameter that you optimize for your ad stock or for your decay rate, right? And there's some sort of recommended ranges that are sort of fairly typical in industry by marketing channel, right? I forget what the exact numbers are, but you'll see it in the code. I included that. So you can kind of start with those. But as you think about these, the model will try to optimize what this ideal hyperparameter is. So for example, in the Facebook decay rate case, it'll try to optimize that between 0 and 30%, right? And that's the decay rate. Alpha and gamma are for they're essentially hyperparameters that control that saturation curve that I've shown you. Alpha will control the shape. So you've seen some saturation curves that were sort of C-shaped. You've seen some ones like TV in our example was S-shaped. So these numbers will control how the shape looks like, right? And how the marginal returns will shape out in the beginning or towards the end of the saturation curve. This controls the inflection point, right? So at what saturation or at what spend level will marginal returns start to diminish heavily, right? That's all it is, right? So this is where you set the hyperparameters. And I'll go fast, guys. We only have 2 minutes left. And this is where you actually run the model, right? So it optimizes. It takes a long time. So in the code that I'll send you guys, I actually have the model that's already run, so you can kind of just read it into your environment for those of you that know how to use R. But just as you think about the scope and the scale of sort of optimizing this model, you're running basically 2,000 models or 2,000 runs of the model. It goes through, I believe, a Bayesian optimization process or maybe some other optimization process to sort of find the optimal hyperparameters. And it goes through 5 trials. So in essence, you're optimizing and you're kind of spinning through 10,000 models, and you can probably do that depending on your computing power in maybe I don't know, 30 minutes or so, right? So it's not terribly bad. So that's all it takes to actually run the model. It will output several models for you. So as an example, let me show you what like one model output looks like. It's really hard to see, but some of the visuals that we went through just now, you can kind of see, okay, this is the impact of each of the marketing channels, right? You see the competitor. This is also the intercept that Kunal was asking about. You'll see the model fit just sort of visually. This is where you see the stats. So you'll see that the adjusted R-square was pretty strong, 94%. Validation was less so. Test was also really strong. You'll see the normalized RMSE score. It was really good for the training set, really crappy for the validation set, less crappy for the test set. So it really indicates sort of overtraining or overfitting on the training data. So you need to make some adjustments, or ideally you want to have these numbers much closer to each other. But again, like if you think the results, like if you think the R-squared is good and the results align with either some empirical tests you've done before for your marketing channels to understand actual empirical lift, and it looks good, like you can probably use it. But again, like you don't want these numbers to be too far from your training set. And then down below, as you look at the code structure, we created a script that lets you understand marginal spends, right? So for each incremental investment for each of the marketing channels, what would be my marginal ROI, right? So you ideally want to have a higher marginal ROI. As the more you spend, the reality is in most cases you'll get a lower marginal ROI because of where you are in the saturation curve. And you'll also see the code for the budget optimization. So the 2 things that I've shown you on the screen: optimizing retroactively your 2018 budget, and then optimizing your sort of ideal marketing allocation for a $10 million spend over the next 90 days or so. Again, 2 examples where you'll see the code. And as you look at the structure, guys, it's really simple. It's really intuitive. Again, it gives you that sort of 80-90% value realization, good enough solution. And like basically you can get an output, and you can get a solution that historically your companies probably would have spent $100,000-$200,000 on and would have taken several months. And so I encourage you guys to check it out. Reach out to me. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but connect with me on LinkedIn or connect with me through my website if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope this was valuable. I know I went through the code really, really fast for those of you that were super interested in that. But I certainly appreciate all your time and all the questions that we had. And please keep in touch. Thank you, guys. Enjoy the weekend.